And when I started my career writing articles and books and so on, anti-Semitism was a bit of it, like a chapter in the book, but not the whole book. And then in 2019, I found myself, to my surprise, publishing a book on anti-Semitism, which is called Strange Hate. And I think that's one of many signs that however significant you think anti-Semitism is, many people do think it's significant, in the sense that you can't have conversations about the Jewish community in Britain and elsewhere without it being one of the first things that people talk about. And one of the questions that people ask, and I'm sure that British Jews in this audience today, when they've been abroad, maybe to relatives abroad, will have been asked the question, how bad is it? And certainly I have heard there's some people here speaking French, assume they're from France or maybe Belgium or Switzerland. But if you're from France, I'm sure you've got used to the fact for many years that when you go abroad to meet other Jews or even non-Jews, they will ask, is it bad? How bad is it? And that's actually a more complicated question than you might think, as we're going to find out. How bad is it? But there are some measures of badness that we can definitely point to. So on the left here is a graph of the number of anti-Semitic incidents reported to the British organisation, the Community Security Trust, which deals with security in the British Jewish community. And they collate incidents of anti-Semitism. They published an annual report on it. And you don't really need to look at the numbers there. You can see that that graph has shot up, and it shot up since 2023 for reasons that would not be a surprise to anybody. And this continues a trend that we've seen over the last 20 or 30 years, which is a steady rise in the number of anti-Semitic incidents with spikes in months and years when Israel becomes embroiled in violent conflict with the Palestinians or with neighboring states. And the spike following October the 7th, 2023 is the biggest spike that we have seen. Not a surprise, I'm sure. And whilst it's gone down a little bit, it's still high. It hasn't returned to the pre-October the 7th baseline, insofar as that was a baseline anyway. But regardless of the numbers of incidents, what we've seen in this country in the last year, we've seen our first deaths from anti-Semitic attacks for, well, almost within living memory. And that was on Yom Kippur last year in Manchester, where there was a terrorist attack on a synagogue. And we also saw other violence incidents, including in Golders Green. I think that was 2 months ago now, either 2 or 3 months ago, where fortunately nobody was killed, but there was a stabbing attack and clearly an attempt to kill more than just those who were actually ended up being stabbed. That violence is often a turning point in a community, although the numbers of dead, if you think about it in those sort of brutal terms, are not yet enormous. But it tends to lead to a transformation in the physical space that Jews inhabit. It certainly has changed here. Now, we always had that security gate, but those who remember 5-10 years ago, there was a security guard here who was here for many years, and he was a really nice, friendly guy. And there was, I can't remember his name. I did once see him moonlighting at Edgware Reform Synagogue as well. Friendly, chatty. There were a couple of other people too, again, friendly, chatty. This is quite an easy area to keep secure. There's one entrance and it's a small one, and there's a high wall and stuff like that. But in the last few months, the revelation, both those attacks, but also the revelation that people linked to Iran were surveilling the Sternberg Center site has caused security to be upgraded. It had already been professionalized in the last few years using a much more professional security company, and there are more of them, and they see their job as not being nice and friendly and welcoming people, although some of them do. And we've seen this in other synagogues as well. So I grew up with my parents regularly being on security, and on security meant standing outside. That's what it was. There was some logic to it, in the sense that simply having one person outside a synagogue can deter at least some people, in the sense that it is inhabited and there are people who are watching. Over the years, you still have people doing security, but increasingly there are also paid professionals doing security out synagogues, and there are more of them. And also those who do security are often trained. And in most synagogues I know of, there are attempts to get more people trained to do that. So that's a real transformation in the British Jewish community. But I want to look more about more than this, and to ask a different kind of question, or in addition, which is, how bad does it feel? Don't worry, I'll explain these graphs, which I was over-optimistic about the size of the screen and the size of the room. Feelings do not correlate exactly with social reality on anti-Semitism or absolutely anything else. So to some extent, the question, how does it feel to Jews about anti-Semitism, is almost a separate question, although they do connect in ways I will talk about. And here I'm going to draw on, I'm going to swiftly swap hats. The other thing I do, as well as being a senior lecturer here, is that I'm a senior research fellow at the Institute for Jewish Policy Research in London, where we do research on these sorts of issues. And although it wasn't actually me at JPL who did this particular piece of work, I want to share a little bit of the data there. This is from a report that we published in October last year, two years after the October 7th attacks, British Jewish Views on Anti-Semitism, Israel and Jewish Life. And that was written by our director, Jonathan Boyd. And it drew on a variety of survey data of British Jews. Now, this graph on the left shows that in 2024, 32% of Jews say they are personally directed at them, experienced at least one anti-Semitic incident during the calendar year. Interestingly, that proportion, and we can talk later about whether 30% is high or not, and that includes all kinds of anti-Semitic incidents from the fairly low level to the much more serious. It's been high for quite a while. It sort of bobs up and down. But in 2020, it was 22%, which is still pretty high. It's not that far off. But what I'm going to focus on here is this graph, which is the frequency of British Jews experiencing what we call ambient anti-Semitism, which I'm going to explain in the next slide. And this is the answer to the question, thinking more generally, have you had any experiences in this period that you considered to be anti-Semitic that were not directed at you personally? For example, seeing anti-Semitic graffiti, online comments, media reports, and so on. Now, what you can see here is in 2023, pre-October the 7th, about 70% of British Jews had seen at least one incident of this kind. They saw anti-Semitism around them. So that's 70%. In 2025, it is 86%. But whether it's 86% or 70%, there is a gap between this and this, right? Only a minority of British Jews, a fairly sizable minority, but a minority nonetheless, had had anti-Semitism personally directed at them. the majority, and increasingly the overwhelming majority of British Jews, had seen anti-Semitism around them. But again, there's complications here as well. This one here shows the percentage of British Jews saying anti-Semitism is a very big or a fairly big problem. In 2025, that was about 92%, something like that. 35 plus 47 is Rachel? 82, sorry, not 92, it's 82, but still, that's still quite a lot. But that has been going up for years, so it actually hasn't changed that much. And so in 2018, it was 47 plus 28, which is late 70s. So it's increased, but not by a huge amount. Now, this was during the Corbyn years, where anti-Semitism became a national political issue. And it's really since 2012 that that's grown, or before that. So it's not like October the 7th changed everything. It didn't go from 0 to 70 miles an hour in 5 seconds. There was always a sense that perceptions of anti-Semitism was a major issue, had been growing up for years now. I want to return to ambient anti-Semitism. Now, that's a concept that we've started using in JPR in the last few years, because it's really helpful in understanding that gap between seeing anti-Semitism and experiencing it yourself. Now, I think it has certain implications. If you see anti-Semitism all around you, it becomes much more difficult to be able to assess personal risk, right? If it is ubiquitous, if every time you turn on a social media app, you see it all around you, or if you see security guards everywhere, then how do you judge how far you're actually going to be impacted personally, what the risk is? One of the things, I wrote an article about this a few weeks ago about the Golders Green attack earlier this year. One thing that really struck me is there's strong reasons to think that the attacker in this instance had deliberately gone to the Haredi bit of Golders Green, or at least the visibly Jewish bit. He didn't go to Temple Fortune. He actually got on the tube. He didn't get out at Golders Green Station. He got off at Brent Cross Station, right? Which suggests a little bit of research that bit is where you find the most visible Jews. The ones with black hats and beards, with shaitels, or at least with a kippah. However, I'm sure, well, I never saw, either being said publicly or privately, Jews who are like me, well, I got a beard, but you know what I mean, who are not visibly Haredi, saying, I'll be fine, right? You know, it was targeted at them, not at me. The fear that was expressed by all kinds of Jews. And actually, that's not something that I'm going to criticize necessarily. For one thing, it's a sign of Jewish peoplehood, that we're all responsible for each other. And when Jews who aren't like us get attacked because they are Jews, we feel it too. So that's not going to criticize that. But nonetheless, that sense of imminent personal threat may have been a little bit not correlated to the extent of the risk. It's always been the most visible Jews. And you see that all Jewish buildings, for that matter. So when Finchley Reform Synagogue, there was a not very competent explosive device. It was an arson attempt a few months ago. I very much doubt that the attacker had looked beyond the word synagogue, right? It says synagogue, that's Jewish, right? So in that respect, yeah, we are all targets for certain kinds of Jews. But again, this is not about personal risk. This is about a sense that anti-Semitism is ubiquitous, it is loud, it is prevalent, it's in all corners of society. And it also flattens different kinds of Jewish experiences in a way that I just talked about. How do Jews deal with anti-Semitism today? One of the things that had a major impact on me this year was, again, wearing my JPR hat, I went to conduct some focus groups in the Netherlands on Jews' experience of ambient anti-Semitism. And what struck me enormously was that there were people there who were having a very bad time. Some of them had personal experiences of quite traumatic events, whether that's workplace bullying or assaults and stuff, but most people didn't. But there were a lot of people who felt entirely alienated from Dutch society. They felt under constant threat by it. They felt they could not get a break from it. So that has mental health consequences. But I'm also interested in the question of how Jews deal with anti-Semitism today, beyond the psychological, and how Jews address it in discourse, how we talk about it. And there's no doubt the one response to it is to attack other Jews. And that was a defining feature of the Corbyn years in the Labour Party, which a lot of the time was a conflict between one kind of Jew and another kind of Jew. And that is certainly what is going on with the Green Party now. Some really, really personal attacks, including from his family. And I'm not saying that Jews should never criticize other Jews. But it is, I think, quite telling that this is a much more focused kind of enemy. Ambient anti-Semitism is everywhere. Jews are not. Jews are identifiable, and Jews make themselves public. So I think that's one of the things we do. Another thing we do is, yes, of course. Another thing we do that I think needs thinking about is sometimes we make a lot of escalating claims and claims of primacy. So I see a lot online and elsewhere, people say after any attack, saying first they came for the Jews, which is, of course, the Bonhoeffer poem. Bonhoeffer, is it pronounced? Says first I think it actually says first they came to the trade unionists. Yeah, exactly. But it's become part of common parlance. It's also dubious empirically, the idea that Britain was an anti-racist heaven, and then they started coming for the Jews. It doesn't really stand up to any kind of scrutiny. But we need to think seriously about why people say that. We have a very noisy public sphere, and in fact, ambient anti-Semitism is experienced precisely because of that noisy, chaotic public sphere. And if you have any kind of cause, or if you're trying to express, say, here I am, in that public discourse about anything, then you've got to cut through. You've got to attempt to cut through. And this is one way of doing it. You see this also with the campaign against anti-Semitism, which has defined itself with this escalating rhetoric of crisis in British society. This isn't just a problem for the Jews, this is a national emergency, this is an issue for everyone. Now, arguably, it is an issue for everybody. In fact, I think it is an issue for everybody, not arguably. Whether it is the issue, whether it is the foundational issue, that's much more arguable. Sometimes this leads to what I would call an ironic sidelining of Jews. This is the EU's 10-year strategic plan, which we're in the middle of now, towards an EU free from anti-Semitism. It's the strategy on combating anti-Semitism and fostering Jewish life. And it starts with a couple of quotes. The first by Ursula von der Leyen, because anti-Semitism strikes at the heart of our values, humanity, religious freedom, equality. Anti-Semitism is a poison for our society. It is up to all of us to fight it, to prevent it, and to eradicate it. And then it quotes Jonathan Sachs in a speech to the European Parliament about 10 years ago, that hate that begins with Jews never ends with Jews. We make a great mistake if we think anti-Semitism is a threat only to Jews. It is a threat first and foremost to Europe and to the freedoms it took centuries to achieve. Now, again, this is an attempt to cut through. And actually, it's almost a necessary step. Because if you say this is for the benefit of X 100,000 Jews in Europe, it doesn't sound very big, does it? It doesn't sound very important, even though it is. And that's particularly true in countries with tiny Jewish populations. Slovenia is about 100 to 200 Jews. How do you motivate? But anti-Semitism is a bigger phenomenon of that. How do you motivate action about it if it isn't to say this is about more than Jews? I do worry, though, about the extent to which anti-Semitism is universalized. This is a debate, by the way, in academic study of anti-Semitism that has been going on a very long time. And there is an argument worth taking seriously that says that anti-Semitism has nothing to do with Jews. It's about non-Jewish fantasies of Jews. So therefore, we don't need to think about anti-Semitism in relation to Jews. We need to think about anti-Semites. That has some validity, but I think it sometimes needs to be questioned because we can be marginalized in our own struggle. Because ultimately, when anti-Semitism exists, we experience it worse. However much anti-Semitism shows wider issues in society, we are at the sharp end, and I don't think we should forget about it. I also think there is a risk of neglecting boring, everyday Jewishness. And I didn't put up a slide here plugging my book from last year called Everyday Jews, but I'm going to plug it now. Buy my book, Everyday Jews. It's probably in the library, but don't take out a copy, buy it. Anyway, and one of the things I argue in the book is, one of the things that motivated the book was a sense that we are becoming so prominent, so significant, so public, that the everyday stuff of being doing Jewish is getting neglected. And a lot of that stuff is quite mundane. I'll give you an example of one thing that's been neglected that is undoubtedly very, very boring. And that is synagogue membership. This is the last report on synagogue membership in the UK. Do you see something noteworthy about it? It's from 2016. For decades, the Board of Deputies used to collate those numbers every year and issue a report. Who was a member, how many shul members there were in this country, and what shuls they were members of, which sounds like an easy thing to do. It's not. Getting Jews to return forms is, well, it's one of the worst jobs in the world, let's face it. Maybe exaggerated. So there are no numbers. Some of the synagogue movements, I know that Progressive Judaism has an idea about this stuff, but none of this means anything very much unless you compare it to something else. And this is one of those things that is dull, but it's dull, but it's dull to do, it's dull to read, it's also essential. And it's one example of the sort of thing that it's concerning me greatly, that in all the attention on anti-Semitism, how are we going to get back, if we ever do get back, to doing this stuff? There was, I can't remember who wrote it, but it was years ago, and I did quote this in the book. It was a comparison to Israel, Palestine, and Northern Ireland. In Israel and Palestine, the eyes of the world are on you if you're a politician, right? And that can be, if not addictive, then certainly a habit forming. One of the things we know, okay, quick, who's the head of the SDLP in Northern Ireland? Quick. Who was the head of the SDLP 20 years ago? Oh, it failed. Okay. John Hume. I mean, I can tell you the head of the Ulster, of the UDP, which is a loyalist, the political wing of a loyalist political group. Anyone remember Gary McMichael? No, okay, maybe I'm just a political nerd. Maybe this was a bad example, but I'm basically saying that the only Northern Ireland politician I know now is Jeffrey Donaldson, and that's because he's been convicted of sex offences, right? None of the rest I know, and that's good, because Northern Ireland is a tiny little place. It's about 1.5 million people. That's the kind of prominence that you would expect from a place like that. Can Jews go back to a state, or Israelis and actually Palestinians and their advocates too, ever transition to a phase when we're just not particularly big, not particularly important people within the world? Would we want that anyway? Because anti-Semitism in the Israel-Palestine conflict puts us, you could choose your metaphor, in the eye of the storm. And that can mean the boring Jewish existence can get occluded. It also has, and I did have an illustration for the following slide, and I chickened out. I think we risk neglecting difficult issues, because if anti-Semitism dominates Jewish discourse, what sort of things can happen in the dark? I'm going to say it. A few days after October the 7th in this country, a British progressive rabbi was convicted, pleaded guilty to child pornography offences. And it didn't make the Jewish press, it didn't make the non-Jewish press. A few weeks later, when he was sentenced, there was a little bit of coverage in the Jewish press, and no coverage as far as I could see in the wider press. And this was undoubtedly a good thing for the reputation of progressive Judaism. It was a bad thing in terms of the necessary soul-searching and difficult questions we have to ask when things like that happen. And what is being missed when there is this huge focus on anti-Semitism? If you read the Jewish press at the moment, it's anti-Semitism in Israel. There are stories, I know, there are things that have happened in the last few years that have barely made the press, that have barely even been discussed on social media, things that should be discussed, because a self-critical Jewish community is an alive Jewish community. And we need to think about what is it we're not talking about when we're talking about anti-Semitism in Israel. So what are some ways forward? First of all, this sounds really obvious, listening to and supporting Jews. But one of the things about the Dutch research that so struck me is this really intense sense by a lot of Jews that they are not being heard. And the more they shout loudly, the less they're being heard. And people they feel dismissed, they feel marginalized. Not all Jews, but a lot of Jews that I experienced very viscerally when I was in the Netherlands. I think a lot of Jews feel that in this case as well. Support is also important. One thing that's emerging in Europe, but as far as I know, has not been developed here as yet, although I think it's being talked about, is specialist support for Jews affected by anti-Semitism. There's an organization called OFEC in Germany. If anybody's heard of it, that's part of what they do. Germany is taking the lead in this sort of thing, in developing social services for Jews who are suffering. Not necessarily suffering from direct anti-Semitic assaults, but certainly from a perception that anti-Semitism is everywhere. So I think this is something that needs to be thought about. How can we ensure Jews are heard within and outside the Jewish community and supported? And just giving people a platform to speak isn't the same as being heard. Second thing, to me, fighting anti-Semitism is only a means to an end. For me, the reason why I want to see the end of anti-Semitism is so we can get on with doing stuff like producing incredibly boring reports on synagogue membership. That's the point, right? I think that fighting anti-Semitism has to be thought of as instrumental, right? Because we want to do Jewish stuff, right? And we want to do that Jewish stuff without having to worry about this stuff. And one of the ways I think we can do that is by valorizing, again, another quote, another promotion for my book, valorizing mundane everydayness and the quiet doing that still keeps the Jewish community ticking over. The trusteeships, the opening the shul up on a Saturday morning, the turning up to shul this Saturday and Friday night, even though you know full well that there's hardly going to be anyone there because nobody wants to be going out and being inside a shul. That kind of stuff. I think we need to remember the purpose of Jewish existence, which is, of course, supper quizzes. And if you're not British, you don't know what that is, right? Supper quizzes, it's a British Jewish thing, although I heard rumors that they also do it in South Africa. But it's certainly not an American thing. That is, most synagogues of even medium size or upwards will do a year that you will get into teams, sit at tables, and you have to answer questions. And well, it's a quiz, basically, and it's over supper. It used to be fish and chips. These days, I've been told it's mostly falafel. But why is this not the purpose of Jewish existence? Right? Why isn't this part of what it is? Doing stuff with other Jews that is not just going to shake the world to its foundation. And another thing, and this is my final point, it's really, we need to push back against significance. And one way we can do that is by remembering that we are capable of mediocrity. Because anti-Semites and anti-Semitism is predicated on us not being capable of that. We are significant, significantly bad, capable of extraordinary feats of organization, capable of all kinds of evil and transforming the world and others to do our bidding. But we're also the people that celebrates the holiest day of the week with the worst wine you can imagine. Seriously. I'm sure if those who have... Polwood is the British Kiddush wine of choice. It's like Manischewitz in America. It's a sweet red wine.
It's worse.
It's really bad. Although my son once tasted Coptic communion wine and said it actually was worse than Polwood. But I'm saying that a reminder of our own mediocrity is helpful here in trying to temper our significance with something else. Okay, questions?
I don't want to underplay anti-Semitism. Indeed, it's bad, but one of the effects of it is for people to exaggerate their own experiences. So an example of that is our member of Parliament was criticised because he made a statement that probably most of us in this room would make, being very, very heavily critical of Ben-Gvir and Smotrich. I imagine everybody was saying that here. He was called out as an anti-Semitic Jew. He was reported to the CST as an anti-Semitic incident. It's ludicrous, but he's still suffering from that. And that's, is there any way we can stop that?
Well, one of the most sensitive questions, one of the most sensitive accusations that many Jews really find difficult is that they're instrumentalizing anti-Semitism to defend Israel or whatever. The Jews are a bunch of cynics and make up claims. And so the challenge is, how do you balance listening to Jews, taking Jews seriously, treating their experience as valid, while also disagreeing with Jews? That is not a simple task. We're possibly in the worst possible place to actually develop a way of doing it. I will tell you how I can do it, how I've done it, is I wrote an article a few weeks ago where I said, my experience doesn't matter. Basically, after Golders Green, I haven't been that scared. I've been troubled by it. I do not feel I'm living in fear. And I'm happy to say it and say it publicly. But I also tied that in with saying, just because I think that doesn't mean I speak for every other Jew, and it doesn't mean you shouldn't listen to other Jews too. My Jewish experience, if it is convenient for you, it shouldn't be convenient for you. How we pull that off, that kind of thing, I don't know. But we're going to have to start at some point.
You speak about JPR. So JPR published a report on the identity of European Jews. Sergio Della Pergola was the author of this report, and the two main identifiers for Jews in Europe were the Shoah and anti-Semitism, and that was before even October the 7th. So how do we get out of that? Because it has only gotten worse right after October the 7th. And you say we have to remember that we can be mediocre, but maybe we don't want to be. If that is such a big identifier of our own identity,
So then, sorry, I can't remember who coined the term. I think it's in America. Someone coined the term October the 8th Jews. Have people heard that? Do anyone remember who it was? Okay, doesn't matter. It's a good term. It's basically people who almost like rediscovered their Jewishness through that. Now, we've seen that at other points in the modern world. We saw that in 1967, the Six-Day War. We saw that, obviously, with the Shoah. We've seen that with 1948 and stuff like that. And that can be the activating event that leads people to become conscious of their Jewishness. The challenge for the rest of us is to take them somewhere, right? Those of us who would be doing Jewish October the 7th or no October the 7th, Holocaust or no Holocaust, are going to have to work to bring people with them. But, and here's the challenge is even more difficult, I don't think we should be engaged in this race for the discourse of the most significant thing, right? I don't think that, because it just creates this cycle of ever more inflated claims, and at some point the whole thing is going to come crashing down. I could say something about progressive Judaism in this country at the moment. I'm not going to say that thing. But you have to see me at Kiddush. But I think it's a great mistake, because ultimately the journey we need to take people on has to include the dull stuff. That doesn't mean, I'm being tongue-in-cheek. That doesn't mean it's all it can be, but it has to include that dull stuff. We have to get people to sit on committees. We've got to get people to lay out chairs, all that dull stuff. Because if Judaism is just about peak experiences, good and bad, then I think we lose something vitally important.
It's only a comment. It would be very interesting to compare these experiences in different countries, because I live in Germany and our mini community has other issues and problems. And it's very interesting to listen to it, where I think the boring stuff, it's not a problem at all. And and it would be interesting, the research,
Pan-European research is something that JPR is involved in. It is very expensive. Not all of it can come out through surveys. I think we also need ethnographic portraits of different communities and how they work and what the texture of Jewish life actually is. My experience of other Jewish, I talk a lot about my experience in Amsterdam in this talk, but I was also very well aware that I'm not a Dutch Jew, and it helped me understand that Jewish community. One thing I think all Jews should do is to discover other communities, for the good as well as the bad, right? I think we do some things right in this country with anti-Semitism. I think we have experience that we could transfer as well as the reverse. That goes for Germany too. I think what OFEC is doing is really, really interesting, and I think we need to be doing it here. And there are things in Germany that I would definitely not want to bring here. With no offense. Thank you.